Hello. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of my presentation, I want to pose two very important questions. So the first is, why am I talking about global inequality? And the second is, why does it even matter? So I'm a STEM kid. I've always liked science, and I don't really intend on pursuing international policy. But I strongly believe that global inequality is something that everyone should learn and understand. Your age, race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. Global inequality affects everyone. And most people don't actually know what it means, what its effects are, and what some solutions are. So I just hope that today I'll be able to explain to y'all what global inequality is, the effects of global inequality, and some solutions to it. So I want to start by defining global inequality. Global inequality is the income gap between rich and poor countries. So although the definition of rich and poor countries is still debated, I will be referring to developed countries as the global north, which you can see in blue here, and developing countries as the global south, which would be in the red. So now that we know what global inequality is and what the global north and global south are, let's see what it looks like visualized. So this blue circle represents all aid the global north has provided to the global south, and this is in the form of care packages, et cetera, et cetera. It is around $130 billion per year. The total net inflow of all wealth into the global south from the global north is around 2 trillion seen in this green circle, and this includes aid, investment, and income and GDP. This red circle, which goes off the slide, represents cash flow from the global south to the global north, and there's a very clear difference here. Almost $3 trillion goes from the global south to the global north. Another way to visualize this is through this bar graph. These red bars represent net outflow from the global south to the global north, and this occurs through a variety of factors. The green bar represents net inflow from the global north to the global south. Now, these red bars can be generally categorized into three different categories of outflow. These include financial fraud, bias from international institutions, and bias from international trade rules. So the three main things in financial fraud include trade misinvoicing, tax evasion, and debt trap diplomacy. The most important one of these three is trade misinvoicing, which accounts for almost $2 trillion of net outflow from the global south to the global north. So an example of what trade misinvoicing would be is, let's say I make car parts and I want to import my car parts into your country. I have 500,000 car parts that I want to import, but there's a tax on each one, so I have to pay a little bit more. So trade misinvoicing would be saying, instead of 500,000 car parts, I only register that I have 400,000 car parts so that I pay a lot less taxes when I import these car parts into this country. And that comes at the cost of the country. The country makes less money, it has less to do in its economy, etc. In biased international institutions, the primary international institutions I will mention are the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. All of these institutions regulate the international economy as well as international finance and trade laws. They also determine several important statistics such as the international poverty level and how countries are doing on food security. Now, the largest problem that all of these international institutions face is that the way these laws are passed and voted on is primarily based on a country's influence in the global economy. In institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, voting power is based on GDP. And obviously, that benefits certain countries, namely the US and much of Europe. For example, in the World Bank, the US alone has 16% of all voting power, and it also has the ability to veto any law it deems it doesn't want. Meanwhile, the entire global south, which encompasses 85% of the human population, and I will say it again, 85% of the human population, has less than 50% of the vote in that organization combined. In addition, the Food and Agricultural Organization strengthens and protects IPRs, and the World Trade Organization also protects Global North subsidies and IPRs. And you may be asking, what are IPRs? That has to do with biased international trade laws. This includes tariffs, subsidies, TRIPS and IPRs, and the WTO Uruguay round. So IPRs are essentially international patents. The same way a company can patent a device in the US, an IPR allows that company to maintain its patent and right to ownership across the entire globe. This means it can set the price in any country of that product to whatever it wants. And this mainly has ramifications in medicine, where several medical devices are patented in poor countries who may not be able to afford these life-saving technologies. The most important thing here, though, is the WTO Uruguay round, which accounted for almost $1 trillion annually in net loss for the Global South. This was a series of conferences in the 1980s and 90s regarding tariffs and aiming to liberalize markets and promote economic growth. Funnily enough, it did the exact opposite and suppressed economic growth for many countries in the Global South. This is because it failed to address subsidies in the Global North on agriculture. It failed to eliminate IPRs, and most importantly, it stifled the ability of nations in the Global South to pass progressive policies that would help their development. So how could this happen? How could we get to a position where it seems like the entire global economy is set up in the favor of the Global North and at the cost of the Global South? How could we get to such a predicament? This is mainly the cause of modern or neocolonialism. So in the 1950s and 60s, many countries in the Global South were being freed, as most of them were previous colonies to countries in the Global North. This wave of freedom meant a large change in government processes, and several governments started using progressive policies such as tariffs, subsidies, and the nationalization of their industries. These are the key things that you need to develop your country to become competitive in the global economy. But the Global North did not like this at all. Why? Because a freer Global South meant more expensive means of production, means of labor, etc. So what did they do? For the most part, they either intervened in these countries or they just outright overthrew them. A great example of everything I've been talking about is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, otherwise known as the DRC. This is a country in Africa that up until 1960 was colonized by Belgium. In 1960, the country gained its independence, and its first president immediately started enacting liberal policies, one of which was the nationalization of its mining industry. For those of you who don't know, the DRC's most valuable export is diamonds. So how did the Global North respond? Well, they killed him and they installed a dictator that would allow companies to regain control of the diamond and greater mining industry. What this did was it completely tanked the DRC's GDP, its GDP per capita, and its standard of living. And today, even though it has one of the most valuable minerals, it is one of the poorest countries on earth. The narrative that the global north is helping develop the global south is frankly a lie. It is not the global north developing the global south, it is the global south developing the global north. Colonialism never ended, it just changed form. So this all sounds pretty miserable and despairing, and it sounds like everything is pitted against the global south and that there's nothing we can do. But it's not the end. Because global inequality is man-made, it can be reversed. It is an imbalance of power and it is not natural. So there are solutions. First, we need to reverse the assumption that aid is the solution. Aid is not the solution, and it has just been hiding the fact that global inequality is severely depressing growth. We need to democratize international institutions and governance of them. At the very minimum, it should be one country gets one vote, not one country gets 10% of the vote. We should allow subsidies, tariffs, and the nationalization of industries in the global south. We have already empirically proven that these three things are the most important things you need to do to develop a country, to make it competitive on the global stage. Not allowing these countries to do these things would severely depress their growth. We need to cancel old debts, and we need to reverse structural adjustment policies. Doing these two things would get countries out of debt traps that are very nefarious cycles that force a country to keep loaning to pay its increasing compounded debts. We need to hold rich nations accountable for damages incurred to poorer countries. In the last 50 years, the global north has taken almost $135 trillion worth of wealth from the global south. They need to be held accountable for this. We need to clamp down on illicit outflows of wealth. This includes all of those red bars on that graph. We need to publish accurate data regarding poverty levels, inflation, and economic growth. One example of this is the International Poverty Line. The Food and Agricultural Organization previously stated that poverty is decreasing at a large level. However, this was based on a false poverty line that did not account for inflation of the dollar. When accounting for inflation, it was actually shown that poverty was increasing. If we do not have accurate data to show that there is a problem, we can't solve the problem. So we need accurate data regarding these things. Finally, we need to set a global minimum wage adjusted for inflation. This would significantly help the GDP per capita in the global south and would allow workers in these countries to get their fair share for all the work that they've done. My overarching goal of this talk was to show you what global inequality is, the problems that it gives the world, and possible solutions. And I want you guys to come back to leave this talk with this one sentence. If you don't remember anything else, this is all I want you to remember. Poor countries don't need aid. They need justice. Thank you.